Welcome to SolarWorks for Illinois. I'm Tim Montague, your host. Today we're breaking down the Midwest solar explosion with Christian Roselund, the U.S. editor of PV Magazine. I'm so excited to have Christian on the show. He is the U.S. editor for PV Magazine. He's been a journalist with PV Magazine for 5 years, and he is the editor for the USA market. So congratulations on that, Christian, and welcome to SolarWorks for Illinois.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here and a very exciting topic.
Yeah, I'm so happy that I went to the Solar Expo back in May up in Minnesota and, got to meet you and see your story about the solar industry in the Midwest. And at the time, you had a story out that there were 44 gigawatts in the queues of MISO and PJM. And just a minute ago, you informed me that that has changed yet still. So let's talk about that number and then break down some of the Midwestern states, maybe starting from the east in Ohio and working our way over here to the Great Lakes.
Sounds great. So yes, we've been looking at the interconnection queues of the grid operators in the region. MISO, PJM, also look a little at SPP in the Plain States. And the numbers just keep rising. Basically, if you go back to 2016, there's no activity. And then in 2017, there started to be some projects, more in 2018 and 2019, it just keeps growing. So what we found last night when I looked up the numbers, specifically in MISO and PJM, only for the Midwestern states, and not including the Plain States, I found 62 gigawatts of projects applying for interconnection. Also looked around and saw that there are 894 megawatts of projects under construction in MISO right now. 2 projects totaling 250 megawatts in Illinois. And in PJM, it's a little bit more complicated because they don't really talk about what's under construction. They just say in the EPC, engineering and procurement phase. Found a bunch of projects there as well. A lot going on in Ohio. And so, these are all large-scale solar projects, right? This is not counting commercial and industrial stuff. It's not counting anything behind the meter, no rooftop. This is just the big stuff. So, we have other sources too, looking at the Ohio Power Siting Board and what they've approved. They've approved a bunch of projects. We found over a gigawatt of big projects that are moving forward in Illinois, several of which have power contracts. Illinois is kind of in Ohio. Ohio is kind of the tip of the spear here. We expect the first big tranche of big projects to come online in Ohio, but we're also seeing a lot under construction in Indiana. We're seeing, there's no Midwest state that is really a laggard here. We're seeing stuff in Michigan, definitely Illinois. Minnesota had long been the leader for the entire region with its community solar program. Now we're starting to see other large-scale projects in Minnesota. So yeah, I would say that we're expecting an unprecedented boom of large-scale solar across the entire region.
Yes, and just to put things in context, we're so excited about the 3 gigawatts or 3,000 megawatts that we're getting through FEJA here in Illinois. And here is the SEIA map of solar projects in the Midwest. This is obviously a little out of date because there should be a lot more red dots going on in Illinois and Ohio and Indiana. But 3 gigawatts was an eye-popping number for us here in Illinois. And now we're talking about, dozens of gigawatts in the Midwest. 62 in the queue. Doesn't mean 62 will get built, of course. And we should talk a little bit about that. But tell us more about Ohio and what is driving the Ohio market.
Well, it seems to be that a lot of these are coming out of that agreement, the compromise that was reached between Sierra Club and the big utilities in the state, where they agreed to procure a certain amount of solar. So we believe that's what's going on. That seemed a lot of these projects hold utility power contracts. We're seeing a couple different developers there. Hecate is there, Open Road Renewables, Enel, Invenergy, all of them are active with very large projects. So yeah, I believe that this is utility procurement. But this is also in excess of what was agreed to in that deal. So it appears that some of the larger utilities are just taking a chance on direct procurement of large-scale solar, which makes sense if you look at the national picture. You know, what we're seeing is utilities across the United States are realizing, hey, you know, this large-scale solar, this doesn't threaten our investments in transmission and distribution. It's a fixed price, so we're not exposed to fuel risk like we are with gas. So we can hedge, you know, a bit here. And, you know, this stuff works, so why not procure it? And that's uneven, I would say, across the country. There are some utilities that are definitely far more invested in coal and nuclear power and gas. Duke Energy comes to mind as a particularly egregious example of this. There are others like NIPSCO in Indiana that have said, hey, you know, look, we're losing money on this coal. This coal costs us too much. It's raising prices for our customers. They hate it. We can do this cheaper with wind and solar, so let's just phase out the entire fleet and let's get this thing done. And that's what we're seeing across the country.
Yeah, it's funny that utilities like to pick on solar and wind for being intermittent, but the price of solar is the same day in and day out. Those photons are free, and no other fuel source can say that. So that is an advantage that solar has, and that is going to increasingly drive adoption of solar and wind. Let's talk more about that NIPSCO story. That really rocked the world, I have to say. NIPSCO announced a few months ago that they're going to make a transition in the next 10 years, shuttering coal, or is it coal and gas?
Coal.
And replacing those coal plants with wind and solar.
Sure, and I think a lot of utilities are still hanging on to gas. I think gas is comfortable for them, but the thing about gas is you're exposed to that fuel price risk. So they have a hedge. Now, and you know, to be honest, gas prices have been cheap for a long time. I think the fracking boom has driven down gas prices, and they've been relatively steady for a while. But you know, you don't know what's happening 5 or 10 years out. Nobody does, really. And that's the thing about these fuel prices, whereas you have a fixed price for solar. Look, you build the thing, that's the vast majority of your investments. That whatever it takes to pay the note on that, that's what that's the basis for your cost going forward 25 years. So, you know, I think it makes a lot of sense as a hedge. And I think that that's a big factor. You know, what NIPSCO did was really pretty remarkable for the Midwest. They're not alone. We've seen this in other parts of the country. FPL is planning to put 30 million solar panels on by 2030. That's more than 10 gigawatts of solar. You know, there are other utilities like Xcel, which have made 100% clean energy commitments. Now, of course, they tend to do this in places where there's either an existing mandate that they have to do this, or that they're worried that one is coming. And so they sort of get ahead of the game and they say, okay, if we're going to be mandated to do clean energy, let's do this on our terms. And I think that that's the shift that we're seeing in the US utility space. Is utilities are saying, this thing is coming, we can't avoid it. And I think they figured out the intermittency, that, you know, intermittency is not the end of the day. If anything, wind is a lot more unpredictable. Solar, if you balance out the solar deployments over a large enough area, you tend to get some power. You know, it's variable how much you're going to get, but you get some power every day. So they can rely on a certain amount of electrons. And, you know, it is variable and intermittent, but it's not unpredictable. And again, it's at a fixed price. So that's a big deal. But the other thing is, we're also seeing a lot of these deployments include energy storage, and that's a complete game changer.
Yes, it is. We could spend some time talking about storage. You mentioned the Xcel story, and for me, that was the big story before the NIPSCO story. Xcel Energy, which is a utility that covers a vast swath of the Midwest, reaching out into Colorado, but then up into Minnesota, has announced that they're going to go 100% renewable by 2050. Is that right?
Correct. Clean energy, zero carbon.
Okay.
They're not promising 100%. A lot of these utilities, including Xcel, they want to hang on to their nukes. Yeah.
How invested in nuclear is Xcel?
They have at least one plant, maybe two in Minnesota. So that's a factor, you know, and a lot of them prefer to factor that in. A lot of these utilities are also planning on running their nuclear power plants for unprecedented lifetimes. Duke, in its long-term plan for the Carolinas, was talking about running nuclear power plants for 90 years, which we've never had. We didn't have nuclear power plants 70 years ago. So by that, we've never seen one run for more than 60 some years.
Yeah, we see the same thing with the Exelon fleet here in Illinois. They're working hard to extend the life. And that's a double edge. We're grateful for FEJA. FEJA was a deal where we got $200 million in renewable energy credits into the market, which is driving now 666 megawatts of distributed generation and community solar, several hundred more megawatts of utility scale. These are mostly 100 and 200 megawatt projects. And in return, Exelon got $200 million in subsidies for Quad Cities, and another plant here in central Illinois. And, that's a good deal for them. But we now have a solar market, whereas 5 years ago, we really didn't, even though we had an RPS that said Illinois is going to reach 25% renewable power by 2025, our RPS was broken. They were letting out RECs in dribs and drabs, and they dried up as soon as they released, right? So we were not on our path to hit 25% renewable energy. Unfortunately, now we've all become aware that we're still not on the full path to 25% clean power by 2025. So take note, solar developers and solar activists, we need your help with the path to 100 to fully fund a 25% RPS. The latest statistic I've heard is that we're going to get to a 17% RPS with the current $200 million of funding that we have per year.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really interesting, what's going on in Illinois is really interesting. I feel like I'm seeing the fits and starts of a market that tries to go to from 0 to 60. The starts to just getting going. And honestly, I don't think the regulators were not ready for that level of interest in community solar. Community solar block program was massively oversubscribed. They had to do a lottery. A lot of developers were complaining about how that lottery went down, and what the lack of criteria for advanced projects, because I think that, one of the things that you're seeing out here, and it speaks to the queue as well, is speculation. You have some projects that are that have a lot of their ducks in a row and are really ready to get built. And then you have other projects where developers are seeing an opportunity to make money, getting an agreement, maybe getting some land, and then flipping the project. And those projects may not be ready to go, but they're kind of clogging up the queue. MISO is complaining about this as well. MISO has had to change its methodology for evaluating projects because they were not ready for 43, if you count MISO South, it's even more, but just without MISO South, what's now 43 gigawatts of solar projects. They're just not ready for this.
Right. And to the IPA's credit, they have managed, they went from 0 to 60. They did not have funding to really have an organization, right? To then having to manage a massive flow of applications and building a whole new program. So kudos to the IPA. They have done a wonderful job managing the solar storm and the solar and wind storm. So we're adding 3,000 megawatts of solar and 1,000 megawatts of wind to the Illinois market, theoretically by 2025 or so. A lot of it depends on the funding mechanism and how quickly we can, augment the REC market. But let's talk a little more about MISO. We know a little more about the MISO queue. You were saying in the pre-show that MISO is a little more transparent about their interconnection queue. Why is that FERC allows the ISOs to operate differently?
Well, I think it's just one of these things, one of these American traditions of decentralization of power, which goes back to the founding of the country. The ISOs have some latitude. And I'm not sure it's that PJM is specifically less transparent. They speak about projects that have gone past getting an interconnection agreement differently. So that's been one hard thing for us when we try to collect all this data, because we looked at all 7 grid operators in the United States for our solar tsunami article that we did in January 2nd, where we found, I forget, 100 and, when you added an SPP, which we missed in that one, it was around 160 gigawatts. But we could compare some things. We could say, okay, this is the number of projects in the queue. This is the number of projects that have interconnection agreements. That's the same. But then when you look at the way that the different ISOs describe the progress of these, PJM says engineering and procurement phase. MISO says under construction. And since the categories that they're talking about are not exactly the same, it's just, these organizations develop differently regionally, and we don't have this kind of centralization of data that they have in some European countries. You know, before I started reporting on the United States as exclusively, I was reporting on the whole world solar market, and I was reporting a lot on Germany. And I can go to Germany, certain German websites, and I can get all the information that I need at a click of a button. I can tell you exactly how much electricity they got from solar last year. You know, it's very easy to find. If I go to EIA, that's a whole different matter. So the data collection in the United States, it's just so, it's so decentralized. It's so much more of a challenge. I mean, for a journalist like me who likes to dig, and my team, we like to dig into data, you know, we've sort of carved a niche out. But the truth is that maybe there does need to be more centralization, and maybe some of these tasks of data collection and dissemination need to be taken more seriously by the US government. Because EIA does some great stuff, some fabulous stuff, but it's been a challenge along the way to get them. I remember when they didn't count the electricity produced by distributed solar. You know,
right.
That was hard.
And their predictions for the growth of renewables are consistently low.
Yeah, you know, that's another thing. Honestly, here's the story. No one has predicted the level of growth of renewable energy that we've had. Even Greenpeace's own predictions fell short. Okay, now there's that, and then there's the people who I feel like are trying. I feel like Bloomberg New Energy Finance is one of those firms that's trying to really get this right. But here's the thing. Solar in particular has an exponential growth rate. If you try to model, and all the private firms like BNEF, what they're all doing is they're advising investors, right? They're giving this information out for people to invest money in. If you take an exponential growth rate and you're off by a year or two, the volume is tremendously different. So you're really in trouble. So they have to do more of a straight line. They can't really model this exponential growth, or else they get into trouble because they're not going to hit it directly on. They're going to be too early or too late. But the funny thing is, everybody is always too late. That's just what's happened with modeling the energy transition. It's happening faster than anyone predicted. And does that mean we're going to be completely out of the weeds by 2030? No, not necessarily. But it means that all the naysayers and all the people who said that this can't be done, yeah, that's not what's happening. And so you look at BNEF is a great example. I look at their EV forecasts. Every quarter, the rate tilts up, and it's sort of like they're doing an exponential growth by default, by the back door. You know, okay, again this quarter we're going to up our expectations, up our expectations, up our expectations. Yeah. You know, forecasting is inherently conservative. There's still no excuse for what the EIA does. That is a crime against forecasting. It's just. Their current data is great. Their long-term projections must be seen as political projections.
Do you have any idea what the fix is, though, in the U.S. for making that data more accessible? I mean, obviously, SEIA and the EIA are working hard to keep tabs on what's going on, but...
Well, in really different ways. I mean, SEIA and Wood Mackenzie have long been prime sources for this information. But, you know, and they're tracking, you know, they could tell you how many solar projects are under construction in the Midwest. They know, but they release that, you know, they're a private organization that sells information to their members. SEIA also, you know, they work together on this Solar Market Insight report, and which is really a key source of data on the US solar market. They're trying, but they're also stuck with some of the same problems. You know, they have to go out. There's a reason why Wood Mackenzie has such a huge team of analysts. They've got to go collect all this data from all these little different disaggregated sources and put it together. You know, this is not an easy task. And you know, EIA, for all the problems with their long-term forecasts, does a bang-up job of getting us data on what's happening right now in the power, or at least 3 months ago in the power markets. You know, we can, and if you know how to access the EIA data, there is such a tremendous wealth of information out there. But it's work.
So let's talk a little more numbers about Midwestern states. Illinois, you know, we, for the last couple of years, have been saying we had about 100 to 200 megawatts. Obviously, that's now ramping very rapidly. Several hundred megawatts are under construction, and we'll be adding gigawatts here soon. but our neighbor to the north, Minnesota, was the leader in the Midwest with 1,200 megawatts. What's going on in Minnesota and Wisconsin?
So Minnesota's really interesting because, you know, the community solar market in Minnesota led the nation. They had the advantage of starting early. They did have a fight with Xcel to try to get a working community solar program. And what's happened is, with the shift to value of solar tariff, Xcel has chipped away at that value. You know, they've just sort of slowly chipped and chipped. Every year it goes down. And so it's not as lucrative as it was before to develop community solar projects. So you still see a bunch that are under construction, but when you start to look at further down the development queue, it gets thin in terms of what's going on with Minnesota. Now, the hope in Minnesota, when I talked to David Schaffer, the head of Minnesota SEIA, he really emphasized the commercial and industrial sector, and that C&I is where he expects it to take off. Xcel does have a pretty good program apparently for commercial and industrial solar, so we can expect some progress there. Wisconsin is not as encouraging. You know, Wisconsin solar market has been, to a large degree, stifled by regulators. And some of the previous regulators that Wisconsin have really pushed the boundaries of lack of professionalism, particularly the Walker those appointed by the Walker administration. And so there's a bunch of really difficult things that are happening. You know, municipalities in Wisconsin want to be able to deploy solar, but the legal maneuvering that is being done by the utilities there, like We Energies in particular, to keep them from doing this is quite remarkable. You know, We Energies knows that it has had a friendly regulatory environment for some time, and they know that they can keep their monopoly, and they are judiciously exercising that. Now, the interesting thing is there's still large-scale solar projects planned for Wisconsin.
Yes,
you know,
there are.
There still are. So, you know, there's some, there've been some large-scale solar projects that have been done with the co-ops, and now there's a bunch in the queue that are being planned. So I'm not sure which markets they're going to sell into, but they're certainly being planned to be built in Wisconsin.
I'm aware of the Badger Solar Project in southwest Wisconsin. I think it's 350 megawatts. Is that in co-op territory, or what is the utility there? Do you know?
I don't know. I haven't. Badger is not one that
No.
We cover so many solar projects. You know, sometimes I may have even covered it. I just don't remember.
What is a utility scale project now for you? Is it 50 megawatts and up, or where do you draw the line?
Well, I really draw the line with something that's connected to the transmission grid. You know, it's a front of the meter project. It's something that's not connected to the distribution grid. And, you know, that can be as small as a couple of megawatts, but
Sure.
I guess the exact definition to me doesn't matter as much. EIA does large scale solar, and we often lump this in as utility scale solar as 1 megawatt and up. So I think, you know, when we're talking about megawatts instead of kilowatts, but the truth is that there are rooftop solar projects on big box superstores that are multiple megawatts.
Yes, there are.
And there's community solar projects. They're on the distribution grid, but they're multiple megawatts. So, you know, like you got this sort of a messy area in the middle there. And what do you call these things? Everybody has different definitions. Wood Mackenzie throws that into non-residential, which is really confusing. You know, that's along with C&I. And then if you look at EIA, they say 1 megawatt and up is large scale solar, and everything else is small scale.
Just here in Illinois, we've built 2.9 and 3.4 megawatt DC projects, rooftop projects. So.
Which is incredible. And those are some big roofs. But hey, there's big box superstores, and most of the time they're not shaded by trees. So it's great. It's great work if you can get it. You know, there's always economies of scale. And the other thing is that I think this is something people don't really think about in terms of the physics of solar, but commercial and industrial solar really is meeting demand at the point of use, because most of the time these are businesses that are operating during daytime hours. They have solar on the roof. They're feeding the lights inside the building. You know, they're keeping the building running. Residential solar, we like to talk a lot about energy independence, and I'm going to offset all, you know, I'm going to offset all my use. Well, that's all you're really doing is offsetting, because if you're gone during the day and your PV system on your roof is humming away, it's feeding the nearest source of demand, which is probably not your house. Now that's great, because it's keeping down the high midday power prices. It's useful to be meeting, and it's probably meeting demand a lot closer than a power plant a few hundred miles away is, but it isn't really offsetting your usage, because that's, unless you have a battery, that's not how electrons work. You know, you're basically supplying something to the nearest demand source, and then you're pulling back later, which is, it's great. And honestly, net metering is a great policy. Is it accurate? No, but it's simple. And that's great. Because as we see with VOST in Minnesota, when you get these complicated policies, they're a lot easier for the utilities to manipulate. And that often isn't in the best interests of the rest of us.
Yeah, I would agree. Net metering is certainly the lifeblood of solar in Illinois for DG, and it's great. There are limitations, and they will be clamping down on net metering as solar adoption increases. But
that's always the case. The utilities have never stopped in the United States trying to kill net metering. And you know, the interesting thing is that it's true. It's not a very accurate description of, it's not a policy that exactly aligns with what's going on in the electrons on your rooftop. But if anything, in the vast majority of cases, people with PV on the roofs are supplying something of greater value than the retail electricity instead of less value. And that's been shown in study after study. I mean, just the fact that you're deferring the cost of the transmission and distribution by not using the transmission grid, you know, by meeting local power. Also, it's great for resiliency. There's all these benefits to local PV. And that's why a lot of us got excited about the idea of value of solar, but unfortunately the idea and the reality, not the same.
yeah, I guess. I mean, it's just an awareness. You know, the greatest enemy of solar and wind in Illinois is a lack of awareness and a lack of understanding of how it works, what it is, who benefits, and but now money is the price of solar, and good legislation is driving these markets, and they're unstoppable, right?
Yeah,
66
absolutely.
gigawatts doesn't happen without a concerted effort on the developer's part. I'll speak to a local project here that BayWa is developing in Champaign County. They've been working on interconnection for over 2 years for this 250 or 200 megawatt DC solar project. So that takes a lot of time and energy. Just the permitting process was 18 months to get a special use permit. And they're still waiting on interconnection with MISO, is my understanding. Now they're looking for offtake, right? They need an offtake agreement. So there's many moving parts, and you know, kudos to the developers. It's a tough road to hoe. Obviously, there is gold at the end of that rainbow, and that's why over 800 community solar projects are now in the queue in Illinois, and only only 100 of them won RECs in the first tranche of the FEJA community solar market. And you know, we're totally psyched to have those 222 megawatts of community solar. That's great for all of the demographics of Illinois. It's great for the construction industry. It's great for clean jobs. It's great for the off-takers. It's great for residents who don't want to put solar on their roof and can subscribe to community solar. So there's so many good things happening. We forget that sometimes when there are bumps in the road, and there certainly are bumps, but generally things are really good. And it's great that the Midwest is on the map. You know, when I started diving into solar in 2016, really in a concerted way, you know, California is the big dog, Hawaii, New Jersey, New York, the Carolinas. And, you know, here in Illinois, we're in the 20s, I think, in the rankings, not even halfway up. Well, now we're being vaulted into the top 10.
Yep. And I expect that. So, you know, when I look nationally, because PV Magazine USA, we cover the national picture, it's been California, 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 California. Q1 of 2018 was the first time, or sorry, 2019 was the first time in 7 years that the top state for solar installed wasn't California. It was Florida.
Right.
More watts installed in Florida. Texas is going to be massive. Texas is the really big, but when I look at the places I'm excited about Texas, Florida, and the Midwest, and broadly in the Midwest. You know, Ohio, Illinois, Minnesota, Michigan. You know, in terms of forward-thinking utilities, boy, Michigan's got a mix. They have DTE and they have consumers. And there's a big contrast between those two because consumers has a much more aggressive plan to deploy solar. DTE still wants to build gas plants. You know, they're tied into that game. But you see significant plans for solar deployment by consumers' energy. So, you know, there's definitely things happening across the entire region. Illinois probably, I think for the midterm is going to be the big driver, but I think, you know, again, there's just, you're right. It's a very positive situation. Things are finally starting to take off. There is some policy tweaks that definitely need to happen to be able to maintain this momentum. But, you know, and I guess another way that I think about this is that this won't always be driven by RECs. We're going to get to a point where, and we're already in some parts of the country at this place, where the cost of building solar is cheaper than any other, in a large part of the country, the cost of building solar is cheaper than any other resource. And so you're going to get to a point where you don't need RECs anymore, where solar is just something that has this financial advantage that is unbeatable. So really, the important thing about the REC market and the other incentives is to get you to the point where you build that momentum. It's to kickstart things, you know, and to get things going. Also, jobs. Man, this is going to be incredible for jobs in the Midwest. No one who's an electrician or a laborer is going to need to look very hard for work over the next 5 years because there's not going to be enough electricians. I don't even know how this staffing challenge, I mean, if I was IBEW, I'd be thinking a lot about my apprenticeship programs because you're going to need just an unbelievable amount of electricians, but laborers too. You know, there's just going to be an unprecedented amount of work building these things.
Well, thank you for pointing that out. We are feeling that pain for sure here at Continental Electrical. You know, we have over 100 field electricians every day now working just in solar. And we could easily double that by next year. And there just are not enough electricians to go around. So to the young people out there, please go to your local IBEW, get into a trainee program. It's non-trivial to become an electrician. There's 5 years of training, but there is a huge reward at the end of that, and you then have a career for a lifetime. Anybody in solar is riding a massive growth curve for the next 50 years. We're at 1.5% of solar on the grid in the United States.
2.3.
Nationally?
Yep, last year went up to between 2.3 and 2.4.
Okay, wonderful. That's great. We're one and a half times more than I thought. But you understand, right? We're going to go to 50% wind and solar, probably by 2050.
Oh, much sooner.
So that is, I mean, it's like being in the automobile industry in 1901. That's the analogy I give to my friends. In 1901, you look at a picture of New York City, right? It's all horse and buggy. There's one internal combustion engine. You go back 12 years later in 1913, and it's all internal combustion engine cars. That's what's happening to the fleet of gas and coal now. It's being shuttered, and it's being shuttered prematurely because of the low cost of energy from wind and solar.
Yep, and you know, so some of the utilities are dragging their feet about this. Duke and its plan for Duke Energy Indiana's, they're really delaying it. But at the end of the day, I just hope the regulators don't let them get away with it, because it's a disservice not only to young people and the people who are going to inherit the mess that we leave, but it's also just plain a disservice to their customers. They could be saving their customers money by building wind and solar and shuttering coal. It's been shown in study after study. More than half of the existing coal plants in this country, more than half of that capacity would be more cheaply replaced with wind and solar by building new wind and solar. Think about that, then taking up an operating plant off the grid. So, yeah. And as time goes on, that number increases every year.
I'm no expert in this, but there's a general lack of awareness of what it means to run a thermal power plant, whether that's nuclear, coal, or gas. running a thermal power plant requires massive maintenance. You've got a giant cooker, right, that's under tremendous heat and pressure. And you're generating steam to turn turbines, lots of moving parts under high stress. So yes, we are going to transition to these lower maintenance, lower cost, and thank God, cleaner sources of power.
Yeah.
You know, the only question now, Christian, and we should dwell on this a little bit, the energy transition, right? The writing is on the wall that climate change is very, very real. It is going to impact all of us. Okay, there is no hiding from climate change. We like to pick on Florida because they're already having flooding, but trust you, we are going to see a lot of flooding here in the Midwest. We're going to see lake levels rise. There's all kinds of unpredictable disruptions that are going to happen, much less the massive flow of people from the coasts to, guess what, the Great Lakes region, which is going to disrupt our economy. But so we have to make the clean energy transition. We know that, right? That's the only safe future for humanity on Earth. We're still dancing around the edges, and yet the growth is now happening. We see the tipping points being crossed in regions in the US, now in the Midwest. What are your thoughts about that?
So this is, I'm glad you asked, because the energy transition, this is the thing that interests me more than anything. This has been what I've been studying for the last decade and writing about every day. And I have to say that, you know, we don't know what's coming or where, and you know, we see these curves of exponential growth, but along the way, there's a lot of things like policy decisions that come in there. You know, there's a lot of individual actors and a lot of individual players, and it is very difficult to forecast the future. But what I will say is that the growth of solar and wind has been faster than any formal entity has predicted. The forecasts have all been too conservative and continue to be regularly too conservative. The other thing is that battery storage is now is an incredibly significant component of all of this. In Hawaii recently, we saw solar plants coupled with batteries, and the batteries have the same capacity as the solar plants, meaning that when the solar is pumping out fully, the battery can discharge just as much. It also means, given the capacity factors over there, given how much sunlight they get, that basically they can store the entire daytime's worth of solar and then generate electricity whenever. These are solar peakers. These can run whenever, between 8 and 10 cents a kilowatt hour. These are contracts that have been approved by state regulators, and they're going to build these projects. This is it. This is the future. This is solar, wind, and batteries, and they're going to be able to generate electricity basically whenever we need them. There are some challenges at very high levels. I'm confident that we have enough time to figure out ways to address those challenges, particularly around low wind output in the winter in northern latitudes and in cold snaps. This is going to require some work and some adaptation, but I think we can do it. The energy transition is unstoppable, and I've seen it just in the past few years, us beat expectations. Now, I don't know what the exact growth rates are going to be. You know, I've come out publicly criticizing SEIA's expectation that their goal, they set a goal to reach 20% solar by 2030. I said that's too conservative. I said that's a decent forecast, but that's too conservative for a goal. We should expect that we're going to be at 20% solar in the next 10 years. Sorry, yeah, 20% of national electricity supply. We should shoot for higher than that, because the energy transition can't wait. You know, I have an 8-year-old son. Our children's future is on the line here. And, you know, there are so many different problems that climate change is going to throw our way that it's not, you know, let's talk about agriculture. You know, changing weather patterns are going to be very serious for the farmers in the Midwest that feed the nation. This is, you know, we've already seen patterns of droughts and flooding and things that have affected crops, and this is only going to get more serious. So, you know, we need to buckle up and get ready for this thing. But the good news is that we're at the beginning of this unstoppable wave. And like I said, I think that every major market analyst, every major governmental body has been too conservative to date about this. And this is going to happen faster than we expected. But that requires individual action by a lot of players. People in the government, people like yourself who spread the word about this. You know, our job in communicating what's going on in the energy transition is tremendously important, because people will fight for this future to come faster if they know the momentum that's behind it.
Yes, and speaking of great media on the energy transition, a shout out to Chris Nelder's Energy Transition Show. And if you just go to the URL energytransitionshow.com, you'll find Chris Nelder's podcast. He does a super great job breaking down the science and technology of the energy transition globally. So check that out. And thank you, Christian, for your interest in the energy transition. I'm sure we'll have to do another show just about that. I want to talk more about battery storage, but I want to also encourage our live audience to chat in your questions or raise your hand. We can unmute you and we can take live questions. This is a great opportunity to talk to an extremely busy journalist. Imagine being Christian Roselund and your head is spinning, figuring out what to follow next. There's so many good stories happening in the solar industry in the US. It is truly mind-boggling. So battery storage, we've done a couple of megawatts of storage installations here in Illinois. Frequency regulation in the PJM market is still a source of income. It's not bankable, unfortunately. And some developers will tell you, well, that market has dried up. But we very much participate in that with our microgrid in Oak Brook at Continental Electrical. And it is a real thing. Of course, you can also do demand charge reduction, capacity charge reduction. You can have resiliency, right? You can have ride through, prevent shutting down in an uncontrolled manner if you're running a manufacturing plant with a big battery. And if you don't have a battery in your facility, and this is critical for all of the business owners and C&I customers out there, if you don't have a battery in your garage or your basement, you cannot keep your array producing power for your facility. Your solar shuts down when the grid shuts down by code. So you have to get a microgrid with batteries, and now battery prices are falling as fast or faster than solar energy. So the time has definitely come for storage, right? We are seeing mass adoption of storage in the expensive markets first, where energy is expensive, like in Hawaii, where they pay 30 cents a kWh. Here we're paying, 3 to 12 cents a kWh. And so it is the economics are different. But let's talk about storage in the Midwest.
So I'm already seeing some of these very large solar projects include storage as well. Some of the ones in Ohio we saw have significant battery components. I haven't seen it as much in the Midwest as I have in other parts of the country, and so I'm expecting there will be more in the future. The difficult part with batteries is getting paid. You just mentioned all the different things that batteries can do, and batteries are amazing because they can do all of these things, right? They can provide, voltage support, they can do frequency regulation, they can help you, shift your power. If you have solar, shift your power output until the evening. There's a million things, but developers have to get paid and asset owners to do these things. So this has been a big process. FERC issued Order 841, and now we're waiting for all of the different grid operators to fully comply with 841, which opens the wholesale power markets to the participation of energy storage. It requires grid operators to write specific rules so that batteries can fully participate. But that's, there's fits and bumps. It's taking a while for some of them to do that, or fits and starts, I should say. So the battery market is growing. I think that you really start to see this in coastal states like California. Well, particularly in California because of the duck curve, because you have so much solar output during the middle of the day, but you end up having this big peak at night, and there's this tremendous need to shift the power output into the evening. Lithium-ion batteries can do that. So they're starting to deploy more and more and more and more and more, and they're getting more comfortable with them. They're finding different ways to deploy them. Hawaii, exactly the same thing. Now, if you look at NextEra, and of all of the big power companies, NextEra they're the largest wind and solar developer in the United States. And they've been probably the farthest ahead of the big power companies in terms of seeing this. You listen to their CEO, they basically say, these are all going to be paired with batteries. We're entering a space here where all the big solar and wind projects are going to be paired with batteries. They're typically talking about much smaller batteries, but we will probably reach a point where the batteries get bigger because, as you said, the battery costs are falling. And this is an economies of scale thing. You know, it's being driven by electric vehicle industry, which is the vast majority of lithium-ion battery deployments are for electric vehicles. So this is the stationary energy storage is sort of the leftover batteries from EVs. But EVs are making they're making battery storage cheaper and cheaper. And we're getting more and more comfortable with them. We're figuring out how to deploy them better. A lot of this, you know, it's economies of scale and it's learning curves. And we should expect that, you know, 5 or 10 years from now, I would be surprised if there were solar or wind plants built in this country without batteries. I'd be surprised if you could find them. I think they're just going to become ubiquitous. And more of the capacity, they'll start to more and more match the capacities of the projects, so that these plants really become peakers, so that they basically just store up electricity and release it whenever it's needed.
I totally agree. And, you know, the duck curve is going to drive this, of course. The duck curve hasn't come to the Midwest yet just because our install base is too small. But in 10 years, we're going to have a duck curve.
Yeah.
Resiliency is critical. And, you know, the great thing about batteries is you don't need net metering if you have a battery with your solar array, right? So this is very important for DG, for residential and commercial solar, who, if you have a facility that is 100% solar powered, that solar array is going to overproduce in the summertime and underproduce in the winter. And it's through net metering that they can take advantage of that value. But if they have a battery, then they can soak up that power during the middle of the day and then discharge the power in the shoulders in the morning and evening or night if they're running at night. And so yes, I agree. We are going to hit that tipping point, and within 10 years, all solar and wind is going to be paired with storage. You heard it here. And already developers that we're talking to are talking about making their solar projects storage ready. There are subtle things you can do to prepare them. And we're talking about community solar. These are 2 megawatt AC solar projects.
Yeah, great. We've got some questions here.
Yes, we do. So keep the questions coming, people, please. This is a great opportunity to have dialogue with Christian Roselund. And Vic asks, I hear there's small scale nuclear plants happening. What's going on with that? Is this real? What are your thoughts about that, Christian?
Well, there are small modular reactors, and bear with me in that I don't spend as much time researching SMRs as I do solar, wind, and renewable energy. I haven't seen any of them commercially deployed yet. And I think a lot about, so having covered technology for 10 years, there were a lot of new emerging technologies within solar that I got really excited about. I got excited about concentrating photovoltaics, you know, where they have the lenses that shine onto a small cell, and those have really high efficiencies. You can get 50% power to those. I got excited about CSP, the big mirrored troughs. I saw one of those in the Middle East. They're amazing. I got excited about SIGs, copper indium gallium diselenide thin film. None of those made it really in the big. CSP plants are still being built. CPV, I still don't know what was wrong with that technology. SIGs is a great technology, but cheap crystalline silicon eclipsed it. So I keep thinking back to something that Paula Mintz, veteran solar analyst, told me. She said a while ago in a public event that I was at, she said, it's a long way from PowerPoints to power plants. And I think that that's particularly true of emerging technologies. You know, the nuclear proponents are really excited about SMRs. They really think they're going to take off. I'll believe it when I see it, basically. I'll believe it when they're commercially being deployed. I don't see that happening. I also have to note that the nuclear industry has a long, long history of broken promises about what they're going to be able to do. In case anybody remembers, too cheap to meter. Well, right now, nuclear power plants using conventional technology are too expensive to build. So I have to look upon what the nuclear industry plans to do with a great deal of skepticism, frankly, like I do all emerging technologies that haven't been commercially deployed.
Yeah, I have to agree. I have nothing against next generation nuclear. We will eventually figure out storage of the nuclear waste, which is the biggest issue with the nuclear industry. But just the cost of construction and the cost of power, it's not competitive today. So the economics are talking right now, loud and clear. We have a question from Art about getting residential solar, it sounds like, in the western suburbs of Illinois. Art, you just got to go to illinoissolar.org. That's the Illinois Solar Energy Association. All of the contractors that install solar across the state are listed there. At least all of them worth their salt. And if, for the contractors out there listening, if you're not members of the Illinois Solar Energy Association, please join, become corporate members. There's a lot of work to be done in the state on the policy side, on the consumer protection side, and that all takes resources. So we have to bolster the industry soup to nuts. But you should have no trouble finding a residential or commercial solar installer now just through the Illinois Solar Energy Association website. Keep the questions coming, people. We're going to go at least 10 more minutes here, and then make a stop at noon or shortly thereafter. But or sorry, 1 o'clock Central. But keep the questions coming. So back to storage, Christian. It is kind of a tipping point thing. We have to remember that the EV market is approaching a tipping point as well, right? There are prognostications that all new internal combustion engine cars are going to fall by the wayside in around 2025, give or take a few years. We can't predict exactly which year, right? But EV is coming in Norway already. 50% of new vehicles are EV in Norway. Okay.
Yeah. The forecasts that I've seen have not been that aggressive. I think BNEF's latest is looking at 50% globally by 2040. I think that that's definitely too conservative, but I also note again that Bloomberg New Energy Finance every year and every quarter increases their forecast. Something to be aware of with EVs is that, you know, the move to EVs will not reduce, that won't wipe out greenhouse gas emissions in transportation right away. It's true the single passenger vehicles are the largest source, but there's going to be a lot of internal combustion engine cars on the road as legacy cars, because when you buy a new car, that car sticks around for the average of, you know, what, I think 7 to 9 years, somewhere around there, you know, the better part of a decade. That car is still expected to be on the road. Now, and I think
we're going to triple, okay, we're going to triple the amount of electricity we need on the grid when we make the transition to electric transportation. So yeah, there's a huge demand there for electricity. And then there will also be a huge supply of batteries, right? We will get the infrastructure to connect the car battery to the home, to the solar, so that it all becomes a seamless system.
Sure, and that's interesting. I hadn't heard the triple figure. One of the things to be cognizant about EVs is that they are vastly more efficient than internal combustion engine cars. Incidentally, this goes back to what we were talking about with power plants too, thermal power plants. You were mentioning how they wear out and how many parts they have. It's just like your car. EVs have vastly fewer parts than internal combustion engine cars, and both of them, you know, I talked to my 8-year-old son, and I you know, we talked to him about cars, and I say, you know, these are basically heaters driving around that also move, because you're losing most of the energy that you put in to the fuel tank before it gets to the wheel. So they're actually very inefficient. The same is true of thermal power plants. Thermal power plants produce more heat than anything. And unless they're combined heat and power, you're not even using that heat. That's just going into the atmosphere. So I think we're going to look back on this period and think, what were we doing burning rocks and, you know, creating all this heat? We didn't even use all the energy we were generating. You know, we just wasted it. And so for that reason, EVs have this tremendous advantage. And that's one of the reasons I think that they're going to accelerate more quickly than anyone is expecting. Also, there's going to be mandates. You know, there's going to be mandates that, hey, we just can't keep selling internal combustion engine cars. But we're going to be stuck with the legacy ones for a while. And I think that that's the thing that sort of, if there's something that keeps me up at night around emissions and around the energy transition, it's the problem of used internal combustion engine cars, all the ones that, you know, before we phase them out, all the ones that are still stuck around for that extra decade, putting CO2 into the atmosphere, you know, and also just, they're just dirty, to be perfectly honest.
So to clarify Art's question also, he's looking for a community solar provider. So it's no surprise that you've been struggling to find a community solar provider, Art. That market just hasn't launched yet, but I know that Nexamp has a website to find consumers. All of the utilities are going to launch websites, including ComEd and Ameren, to help their consumers find community solar projects. And then, of course, there is Illinois Solar Energy Association, illinoissolar.org, which will also have links to the developers who are owning and operating those community solar projects. So don't worry, you will find a community solar project. Now, of the 100 projects that are getting built, they will get subscribed fairly quickly because that's mission critical for the ROI of those projects. So you have to pay attention. It is going to be a bit of a blip, and subscriptions will fly off the shelf. So stay tuned. That's coming. What else do you want to talk about, Christian? I'll let you lead the way here.
Well, it's interesting because when we first were going to talk, we were going to talk about an article that I'd written that was about frequency regulation and how the grid handles frequency regulation. And to me, that's an interesting subject because that was one of the thornier things is, okay, we have to keep the grid at a certain frequency or things break, right? Well, fortunately, we have relays and trippers, we have various mechanisms set up so that the grid just shuts down before it goes too far out. But the way that we're doing frequency regulation right now is when a large power plant goes offline, and this speaks to the whole people's concerns about variability. People have to understand that grid operators and utilities already are dealing with situations where they unexpectedly lose power because power plants will have problems and have to go offline, right? So they have to adjust for that event, those circumstances. So interestingly enough, when a power plant goes offline, the supply-demand balance is thrown out of whack. That affects the frequency. So you basically end up getting frequency that ends up being slowed by the large rotating masses that are on the grid. So people say, oh my God, what do we do when we don't have these large rotating masses helping us control the frequency? Which incidentally, if you don't meet that supply-demand imbalance, you're going to have a frequency problem. All the large rotating masses do is slow down your frequency problem. You still are going to go out of whack until you fix that. Well, the great thing about inverters is inverters can just plain set the frequency on the grid. The power electronics we have in these things is amazing. So, there is an engineering challenge to figure out how to switch over. But we know from microgrids that we can run a grid using inverters to set the frequency. Right? And some of the inverters will actually set the frequencies and others will follow. But what we have in those power electronics is a much more sophisticated way of handling frequency than we do with these large rotating masses, which, like a lot of things in our power system, it was probably the best thing we could figure out at the time, and it sort of worked. But it's really clunky and primitive compared to what we can do with power electronics. We're in a new era where something like frequency control, that's not really a concern anymore. Or that's not going to be a concern at one point in time. We do have to bridge the transition between the large rotating masses and the inverters. And having inverter-based control. And that's going to be, no one's really, I think, has figured out exactly how we're going to make that move yet. But this brings up the other interesting thing, which is distributed energy management systems, DERMS. This is another area that I think is tremendously exciting. The grid of the future is not just wind and solar. The grid in the future increasingly is going to be meeting demand close to the point of demand, meeting demand with rooftop solar and batteries and local resources as much as possible because it's vastly more efficient. It's vastly more efficient than having to send power down these power lines and wear them out. These things are tremendously expensive. So but to do that intelligently, you need to have a system that manages it. So in the future, I don't think that people are going to be really choosing to take their battery and leave the grid. Really, that battery and that PV system and that inverter has tremendous value to the grid. If there's a management system that allows you to use those inverters and those batteries, you can solve all kinds of problems. And that's the most efficient way to do it, is with management software that allows you to shift resources around. We're going to have so much better of a grid in the future. And there's companies who are already developing products. PICE Energy got a contract to do DERMS management for Western Australia. which is bigger than Texas, right? Thousands of different generators, large and small, and specifically the behind the meter resources, all the solar and batteries that they have in Western Australia, where it's a long way to the local power station. They're everything that's connected to the grid, they're going to be managing and synchronizing. And that's a new frontier that I think that we're going to be hearing more and more about in the United States.
Well, obviously we have to modernize the grid. The bankruptcy of PG&E in California due to the fires, right?
Yeah.
It's just staring us in the face that our infrastructure is too old, too decrepit, and not modern enough. And grid is basically a 100-year-old machine. It's the most complicated machine that humans have ever invented, and it's lagging, and it's decrepit, and we totally need to transform the grid and catch up with all the good technology that we have. And so that is another good thing about wind and solar coming on, is it is forcing that conversation, I think. And batteries pair so nicely with wind and solar and really make for a very stable and resilient grid. Nobody can really poke holes.
No, I mean, it's just simply a better technology. Well, it's interesting you bring up PG&E. PG&E is also a crisis for the utility business model. Just like our grid is somewhat antiquated, our utility business model is also antiquated. The idea that your utility gets paid upon building infrastructure, which they convince regulators that they need, we can do better than this, frankly. The way that the CCAs have taken generation out of the hands of the utilities and put it in the hands of communities who are making decisions about the resources they want. The funny thing is, the CCAs, they don't even want to take over the grid. They say, okay, PG&E, this is your grid, you run it. Can you please run it better than you used to? Maybe if you weren't busy making procurement decisions, maybe you could run your grid better. But I think that in the end, we're still going to need some long distance transmission lines, and there's some real advantages to having the transmission. But having that idea that the centrally located power plant sends power hundreds of miles to your home, we can do better. That's just.
Well, and that brings up HVDC, so high voltage DC. The Chinese are investing quite heavily now in HVDC. We are very much dancing around the edges. We have a few pilot projects. Do you see any HVDC coming on? Is that a technology that the US is even going to consider at this time?
I haven't looked closely into that, to be honest. Some of the transmission stuff has been a little bit outside of my daily work. It does seem like a compelling technology, and I wouldn't be surprised. The problem with power lines has been local resistance. It's been NIMBYism, and that's been a real sticking point for getting. That's been a real sticking point for getting to where we need to be.
Do you need to wrap up?
I do need to wrap up, unfortunately.
Yep, that's fine. I want to acknowledge Jonathan's point that you can check out IllinoisShines.com. That is the consumer-facing website for the distributed generation program here in Illinois. So that will eventually connect you to community solar projects as well. Well, Christian, we could literally talk for hours, I'm sure, and it's been such a great pleasure having you on. I do want to make a quick announcement before we wrap up, and that is that we have some great upcoming shows on SolarWorks for Illinois. In July, I'm hosting Kevin Borgia, who is the Midwest Policy Director for Cypress Creek Renewables. Cypress Creek, as most of you know, is one of the largest solar developers in the country. And we're going to break down the path to 100% wind and solar in Illinois, 7 steps to a clean energy future. Then in September, I'm hosting Jonathan Roberts, Vice President of Development in the Midwest for Soltage, a developer from the East Coast. Building a solar portfolio in Illinois, challenges and opportunities. So look forward to that. And then in October, Rob Davis, Director of the Center for Pollinators in Energy at Fresh Energy up in Minnesota. We're going to be talking about pollinator and wildlife friendly solar farms in the Midwest. So lots of great content coming your way. You can find all of it at seco.com. That's CECCO.com/solar webinar. Once again, thank you so much, Christian, for coming on the show. Really appreciate it, and we'll be in touch.
Thanks for having me.